Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
As one of the three Abrahamic religions, Islam is a religious, cultural, and political force. Like its brother religions, it has influenced civilizations throughout history. Islam is the world's second largest religion after Christianity, with approximately 1.5 billion adherents. The last century in particular has seen the growth of what has been called, in quotes, political Islam, manifested in the last 50 years with the rise of Islamic political parties, such as the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is a religious and political group founded on the belief that Islam is not simply a religion, but a fundamental way of life. However, the rise of groups from Al-Qaeda to ISIS has resulted in widespread fear of Islam's ideology, making it one of the most misunderstood religions in the Western world. Our distinguished author, Dr. Shadi Hamid, will discuss how Islam relates to politics and the implications for how we understand the future of the Middle East. Dr. Hamid is a senior fellow in the project of U.S. relations with the Islamic world in the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institute. He is also, most importantly, vice chair of the board of directors on the project on Middle East democracy. Temptations of Power, Islamists in Illiberal Democracy and a New Middle East was named a Foreign Affairs Best Book of 2014. He's a contributing editor for The Atlantic, as well as being a member of the Middle East North Africa Mensa Advisory Panel for the World Bank. Please join me in giving a warm World Affairs Council welcome to Dr. Shadi Hamid. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tony, for the kind introduction. Thanks to all of you for coming. So, I think this is a difficult time to talk about Islam and Muslims, and obviously Islam and Muslims are in the news on a pretty regular basis, even when things having little to do with Islam and Muslims are going on. And I think that there's obviously a lot of anti-Muslim bigotry in this context, in the era that we currently find ourselves in. So I think that makes it challenging to sort of find the right way to talk about what is really a very sensitive topic, which is, is there something fundamentally different about Islam as a religion, as an idea? And that's part of what I'll try to talk about tonight. I think that I'm not someone who wants to sort of take the politically correct approach, if you will, which is to say that Islam is just like all other religions. I think sometimes there's a tendency in pushing back against sort of the Islamophobia that we see today, and also the anti-Muslim comments from, let us say, very senior officials in our government, that there is, I think, an understandable tendency to sort of push back aggressively and to try to minimize differences between the faiths, which is well-intentioned and well-meaning, of course. And it's also interesting that I think in this, just over the past year, you see things that I would have never dreamed of seeing, which is Democrats or liberals here in the US protesting for or rallying in support of Muslims praying in airports. But we saw scenes of that, obviously with the Muslim ban that happened, or the travel ban that happened earlier this year from the Trump administration, that to sort of express your support for Muslims that you would, you'd go to an airport and have signs and show your support in that way. And it almost became a way of establishing your partisan identity. So I think that sort of gives a little sense of the overview. Now, what I want to do here is sort of offer an alternative way of looking at it, and that's what I'll try to do. That's also what the new book, which is called Islamic Exceptionalism. I think there was a copy out there that you can probably guess what part of the argument I'm trying to make, which is that there may in fact be something exceptional about Islam. So there's a lot to unpack there, so I'll try to do that. But before that, I'll just offer some context from my time spending in the Middle East of really how this new book came to be, and how I've also changed myself as a researcher and a scholar who works on these issues. So I was in Tahrir Square on February 11th, 2011. And many of you will remember that was the day that Mubarak, the longtime dictator of Egypt, fell. So it was one of those once-in-a-lifetime moments to see sort of this peak of the human experience where people who hadn't felt freedom really forever had a taste of it for the first time, and there was a lot of optimism. And I was living in the Middle East at that time, and I suppose I got swept up in some of that myself. But I was also able to see the decline and the failure of the Arab Spring, which happened rather quickly. And I think that has really had an effect on how I view the kind of situation that we're living in today. So that's one thing, is that I've become more pessimistic. I think also I've come to appreciate more and more over time the role of religion, the power of religion, and its relevance in everyday life. And that's something that you can see in a very powerful, profound way if you live in the Middle East in what we might call more religiously conservative societies. And one thing I want to do is to sort of challenge you and also me, because I'm part of this as well, as someone who has grown up in a sort of secular background in the bastions of Northeastern elite liberalism. DC is obviously a part of that, that sometimes it can be hard to take seriously or seriously enough the importance of religion and religiosity. And sometimes we have this tendency, I think, to see religion playing a role in public life as something that's irrational, something that that shouldn't be. And I think part of what I'll do also is try to challenge some of those assumptions. Now, let me get, and one example of that challenging of assumptions is really on this question of why do people do what they do? What motivates people? And when we talk about rational reasons for doing things, we tend to think about things that you can measure, that are tangible, whether it's economic factors or being angry at the US or rural-urban migration. There's a lot of different factors that academics who work on these issues will look at. But I'll just give you one example from my time spending time with members of Islamist movements and leaders of Islamist movements in the Middle East. One conversation that sort of stands out that I think captures this quite well. So I was talking, Tony mentioned the Muslim Brotherhood, and there was one conversation I had before the Arab Spring where I was talking to a mid-level Muslim Brotherhood official, and we were talking about why do people join this Islamist movement. And I'll just very quickly mention that Islamist groups are those that believe that Islam or Islamic law should play a central role in public life. And that's a word, Islamist, that gets bandied about a lot, so that's how I'm defining it here. So we were talking about why people might join groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. And we were talking about all the different factors that might play a role. But he said, Shadi, sometimes it's quite a bit more simple than that. Sometimes people join the Muslim Brotherhood because they want to get into heaven. And I thought this was an interesting way of putting it, because that would sort of fall in the category of something irrational that we as sort of Westerners of products of a secular background might have trouble grasping. But if you look at it from a certain perspective, what could be more rational if you believe in God? If you're someone who believes in God, and not just that, believes in an afterlife, what could be more rational than doing something for the afterlife? Because after all, that is eternity, right? And the idea here would be that if you join the Muslim Brotherhood, that provides more structure. It provides a community of fellow brothers that help you become a better Muslim. And if you become a better Muslim, then you have a better chance of entering paradise. So if you look at it from that perspective, that could actually be a very rational way of looking at the world, that you are doing something, so if you're voting for a political candidate, if you're joining a protest or a sit-in, there might be political reasons in this world, but there could be an ultimate reason as well, that you're doing this ultimately because you want to serve God. And that can be a different way of understanding political action. I mean, obviously, I don't think most of us are joining protests here in the US or voting for at least Democratic candidates because we want the afterlife. Perhaps there are some people on the Republican side, but that would still be, I think, a super common thing that you hear in terms of motivations. Okay, so with that context, let me get into the basic argument that I make in the new book, which is trying to get at this question of how much does Islam really matter? So when we're trying to understand the failure of the Arab Spring, the rise of ISIS, all the tensions that we hear in the headlines around Islam, how much of it is about politics and how much of it is about religion? And that gets to the very challenging question of, is there something different about Islam that contributes to the conflicts that we're seeing? Now, I do argue that Islam is exceptional, not just in any way, because in some maybe obvious sense, all religions are different from each other. Otherwise, what would be the point of having different religions? There wouldn't really be one reason to be a part of one religion versus the other. And if you talk to believers of any given faith, they will presumably think that there's something unique about what they believe in, right? So I'm not talking about just the kind of random ways that all religions are different from all other religions. My argument is that Islam is fundamentally different in a specific way, in a way that matters quite a lot, in how it relates to law, politics, and governance. So what this would mean, both in theory and practice, is that Islam has proven to be resistant to secularization. Islam continues, despite efforts at secularization, to play an outsized role in politics and public life. And that for a better part of 14th century, since Islam's founding, Islam has played this outsized role in public life. Now, the question then would be why? Why might Islam be resistant to secularization? And when I talk about secularization here, there's a lot of ways to think about the secular, but I think one way that I would just emphasize here is that efforts to privatize Islam, to make it less relevant in public life, to make it more of a private concern that has to do with an individual's relationship with God. Obviously, part of Islam is about that, but Islam isn't just that. It can't be reduced to the private, despite what I think were hopes and expectations that over time, because of the process of modernity and modernization, Islam would become more of a private concern and relatively less of a public concern. That has not happened. And I would argue, I can't speak to what will happen in 200 years or 500 years, and I guess by that time it wouldn't really matter, but I would say for the foreseeable future, any expectations that Islam will become privatized or secularization gaining more traction in the Middle East and the broader Muslim world is unlikely. So I'm making an argument about probability that this is not likely based on what we know and what we've known for quite some time. Okay, so I'm going to focus on two reasons here that help to explain why Islam might be distinctive in this way. And to kind of get at those sources of distinctiveness, we have to go back a little while. And I don't have a whole lot of time here, but I will try to cover 14 centuries, or actually in some sense even 20 centuries of history very quickly, because I want to contrast Islam with Christianity to understand what might be different, especially when we're trying to compare it to the religion that I think most of us are most familiar with here in the United States. So, this might be a banal thing to say, that the founding moments of religions matter. So if we want to understand Islam, we have to be somewhat familiar with the founding moment of Islam. And if we want to understand Christianity, we have to be vaguely familiar with the founding moment of Christianity. That's not to say that Muslims are bound to their founding moment. It's only to say that Muslims can't fully escape their founding moment. But also to say, why would Muslims want to escape their founding moment? Because presumably their founding moment matters to them as well. So I think to kind of take that seriously is a first step. The first thing here is that if we want to understand, and we have to go back to Prophet Muhammad and the founding and the early generation of Muslims, is that Prophet Muhammad wasn't just a theologian or a man of God or a prophet. He was also a politician. And not just a politician, he was also a head of state. And not just a head of state, but a state builder. And this is quite important because in the person of Prophet Muhammad, both political functions and religious functions are intertwined, not by accident, but by design. It was meant to be that way. He was supposed to have both of these functions. And this is in contrast to, say, to quite importantly, Jesus, who wasn't someone who was governing. Jesus was not ever in a position to govern territory. Jesus was a dissident against a reigning state. So naturally, the New Testament is not going to have much to say about governance or public law, because that was not the position that Jesus and his early followers found themselves in. They didn't have to contend with questions of governance. On the other hand, Prophet Muhammad and the first generation of Muslims did have to contend with questions of governance. So naturally, the Quran is going to have something to say about governing. It's going to have something to say about legal matters. Otherwise, it wouldn't speak to the circumstances of the time that the early Muslims found themselves in. So in some sense, I'm not making an essentialist argument that religions have to be one way or the other. I'm making an argument that how religions evolve in that very crucial early moment matter, because revelation has to speak to those particular circumstances. So that's the first factor that I would mention here. Now, the second factor is a little bit, maybe in some ways more complex, but I'll just do the short version of it. But it has to do with how Muslims view Scripture. So again, just sort of taking Christianity as a point of comparison, if you talk to the furthest right Christian evangelicals in the US, the most extreme people you can possibly find, they might say, and I think all Christian evangelicals, whether they're far right or moderate or progressive or whatever, would say that they see the Bible as the Word of God. Muslims, regardless of whether they are conservative or not, would go one step further than that. They would say that the Quran isn't just the Word of God, but God's actual speech. And this would be a creedal requirement. So it would be very hard to be Muslim if you don't believe in that creedal requirement. So in other words, just as it's hard to be a Christian if you don't believe in Christ, it would be hard to be a Muslim if you don't believe in this creedal requirement of the Quran being of divine origin and that it is God's actual speech. And that might seem like a semantic distinction, but I'll just explain what I mean by that. So from a Christian standpoint, if you're talking about the Bible being the Word of God, no one would deny that parts of the Bible are written by men, that there is some role of human authorship. The Quran, on the other hand, is seen quite differently in the sense that every letter and word is directly from God, is of divine origin. There is no conception of Prophet Muhammad playing any role in the actual writing of the Quran. And there has been no branch or denomination or sect in really Islamic history, not one of note, that has argued that Prophet Muhammad wrote parts of the Quran. So this idea that every letter and word are directly from God is really important from the very founding of Islam. So that has implications for how Muslims understand their own scripture. That's not to say that Muslims have to be literalists. The majority of Muslims are not literalists. It's only to say that scripture matters, that you can't just ignore it or put it to the side if you're talking about God's actual speech. You can contextualize it, you can interpret it, and Muslims can have profound disagreements. Let me be very clear about that. Profound disagreements about how to interpret God's actual speech, but they would all come from the basic premise that they are dealing with God's actual speech. And so there's a sort of sanctity to the text that there may not necessarily be in other religions or in other interpretations of other religions. So in practice, what does this all mean? What it would mean is that you could have secularizing interpretations of Islam and Islamic law. You can have Muslim secular reformers. And there are very brave voices that have made an argument for separating religion from politics in the modern era. But my argument would be those arguments don't gain mass traction, and it's very hard for them to gain mass traction when it comes to the masses of ordinary citizens in the Middle East and most of the Muslim majority world, because it goes against the founding moment. And it's hard to tell an ordinary Muslim who doesn't want to get into a lot of intellectual hermeneutical arguments about progressive reinterpretations of the text. It would be it's hard to argue that Islam should accept secularization when Prophet Muhammad, the person that all Muslims or most Muslims want to try to emulate, is someone who intertwined both religious and political functions. Again, it's not to say that these arguments can't be made. It's only to say that it's harder for these arguments to gain traction. And I would argue that's why these arguments haven't gained as much traction as perhaps some of us might expect or hope. Okay, so as I sort of, let me just move now a little bit to the modern context and try to work out a little bit what the modern implications of this argument are. So if you accept my premise, then how does this premise play out? So let's talk about, I mentioned earlier the rise of ISIS, the failure of the Arab Spring, all the things that we're seeing now in the Middle East. I think there's a tendency when we're analyzing is to look at just the recent era or just a few years ago. So for example, we might look at 2011, the start of the Arab Spring, or we might look at 2003, the US invasion of Iraq. We might go back, if we're looking more at Iran and Shia Islam, we might go to 1979. But there's another date which I think is quite important that we don't talk about, in addition to obviously the founding moment, that we don't talk about much, and I will tell you that date, 1924. Unless, I'm sure this is a very smart group, and maybe some of you are all nodding, oh yeah, 1924, we know all about that. But for those of you who don't know what happened in 1924, 1924 marked the formal abolition of the last caliphate, which would be the Ottoman Caliphate. And that might seem like a long time ago, but also in a way it's not that long ago. So theoretically, there are people in the world they're pretty hard to find, and they would have been like 5, who were alive during the tail end of the last caliphate. But generally speaking, all of us, or most of us, throughout the world, we're only familiar with nation states, or that's what we're primarily familiar with. The idea of living under a caliphate would seem quite foreign. But it's a very important date because it marks a break. So from essentially the time of Prophet Muhammad until 1924, there had always been at least one caliphate somewhere. Oftentimes there were more than one caliphate, and the caliphates could sometimes be competing, but there was always something called that somewhere. Now, what we see since 1924 is a vacuum of legitimacy. And ever since then, ever since 1924, there has been a struggle to establish a legitimate political order in the Middle East. And at the center of that struggle are a set of unresolved questions that are very difficult around Islam's relationship to the state's relationship to Islam, the role of religion in everyday life. And nearly a century later, those questions remain unresolved. Now, the question is, why has it been so difficult to address these fundamental and foundational questions? Part of the problem simply has to do with historical circumstance, that Islam was revealed in the pre-modern era. Islamic law, what we would call Sharia, was designed for the pre-modern era. Again, it was revealed in 7th century Arabia. The question then becomes, how do you adapt something which was meant for the pre-modern era or evolved almost entirely in the pre-modern era for an era of nation states? That becomes a kind of puzzle. And it's one that I would argue is at the center of a lot of the debates and conflicts that we hear about what to do about this question of Islam and how much should it matter in public life, what to do about Sharia or Islamic law. And in some ways, it's a circle that you can't square, again, because Islamic law evolved in a very different time when states weren't powerful, when there wasn't a unified law. Our very conception of law was different. Also, even the way we talk about religion and politics, and the way that I started my talk tonight was by sort of saying that there is something called religion and something called politics. We should also all be aware that's very much a post-Enlightenment way of talking about religion and politics. In the pre-modern era, we would just assume that the two were so intertwined that we couldn't really separate them. There wouldn't be separate categories for religion and politics. And even now, in my own fieldwork and interviews, when I'm talking to members of Islamist movements, if you ask them, hey, ex-Islamist or ex-Muslim Brotherhood member, why did you just do what you did? Or why are you doing what you're doing? Is it because of religion or is it because of politics? They won't necessarily be able to answer that question because for them, again, the two are very much intertwined. So the difficulties that we're talking about are very much a product of a modern set of circumstances. Another way of looking at this is that if we were having this conversation 4 or 5 centuries ago, there wouldn't be a word called Islamist. There wouldn't be a word Islamism. Because for the better part of 14 centuries, during the entirety of the pre-modern era, no one questioned that Islam provided the overarching legal and moral architecture. There wasn't something called secularism to challenge Islam's dominance in public life. It's only in the modern era, again, where new ideologies are being introduced from the West that people need to sort of go out of their way to affirm Islam as a distinct political order. And that's how we come up with the term Islamism, which is just people who are going out of their way of saying that secularism is not good. We are reacting against secularism. And the way we affirm this identity is by calling ourselves what would come to be known as Islamists. But there would be no need to declare that in say, the 16th century or the 15th century because it went without saying, so it didn't need to be said. Okay, so we have a dilemma here, and in my last few minutes here, let me just, I'll try to, I always try to think about how I can end my talks on a positive note. We'll see if I can pull it off tonight. It's hard considering the subject matter, but we'll try. So the divides that we see in a lot of the countries that I pay attention to, and a lot of the countries that get a lot of attention in the news, there are other factors, of course, class dimensions, economic dimensions, education, and so on, but the primary divide is oftentimes between what we would call Islamists and non-Islamists. And what are they divided over? These unresolved questions over the role of religion and Islam's relationship to the state. Now, it's difficult to resolve foundational questions like that because they're kind of intangible. You can't measure them. So if we were doing this talk, I guess 6 years ago, what I used to do when I talked about these foundational divides is that I would make this contrast and say, well, in the Middle East, there are these intangible divides, but in the US, we debate things like policy, and that's the main divide. Now, you can't really say that because that's not what our main divides are about in our sort of new era here in the US. So I think in some ways, Americans might be better able to relate to foundational divides because a lot of our own conversations, especially the past year, are about the fundamental who are we questions of identity, of what does it mean to be an American, what does America mean, what are the founding ideals of it. So that's sort of, in some sense, what I'm talking about here is that where Egyptians or Tunisians or Jordanians, they can't agree on the basics of what it means to be a state, of what it means to be Egyptian, Tunisian, or Jordanian. Where with, say, economic issues or, say, like tax policy, theoretically, they deal with numbers, even though there is ideology there. You can at least talk about marginal tax rates. How do you, and split the middle maybe on them, how do you split the middle on questions of the role of Islam in everyday life? If you are a sort of classical liberal, someone who believes in non-negotiable freedoms, you will think that certain things can't be negotiated on. If you're an Islamist and you think Islam should be part of the Constitution, that is part of your core belief and you don't want to negotiate on that. How do you split the middle? It's difficult. And that's part of what is driving many of the conflicts and divides that we're seeing today between these two sides. And obviously there are different, it's a spectrum, so it's not just one or the other, but yeah. So, and it has to do with these questions around the meaning and purpose of the nation state. What should the nation state have an ideological mission, or should the nation state be neutral and allow equal space for all religious persuasions? Now, let me now start to close up with two potential ways of dealing with this problem or dilemma. The first one is to say pretty much that Muslims should follow the same trajectory that Christians and Christianity did several centuries earlier, and go through a kind of reformation followed by enlightenment, then moving towards secularization, then moving towards the end of history of liberal democracy. I mean, that would sort of be the progressive ideal, that over time people naturally move in this direction. And that's part of what's happened, perhaps a little bit less so in the US than compared to Europe, but in Europe we see a fairly thorough secularization, where religion no longer, or at least Islam might play a role in public life with Muslim minorities, but Christianity in most European countries no longer plays a very big role. And I think that you often hear this rhetoric of, oh, Islam needs to go through a reformation, just like Christianity did, and that is the solution. I am very skeptical of this approach, and not just that, let me be a little bit more explicit. I think that's a dangerous approach, because it assumes that Islam is like Christianity and therefore will follow the same trajectory as Christianity. But if you follow my premise that Islam is distinctive in these particular ways, then there's no reason to think that Islam will follow the same linear trajectory that I just mentioned. Also, it can be a little bit patronizing, and it's very well-meaning, of course, and I don't mean to, and people who I like have said basically these types of things to me, but like, oh, you guys are having some trouble now. You're going through a lot of conflict. Don't worry. We Christians went through that too. You'll get through it. It's taking you like a little bit longer, but you'll get there, just a matter of time, which, yeah. So, but I think it's also a problematic idea to assume it can also lead to repression. To have this idea that secularism is the goal or that Islam should be more privatized, what that leads to are efforts to essentially exclude Islam from the public sphere. And in practice, that can lead to repressive approaches of forced secularization. And we've seen examples of forced secularization in Turkey, Tunisia, and other contexts, or in another way of banning Islamist parties, even parties that may be peaceful, that might accept the democratic process, to essentially say that they have no right to participate and to repress them and so on. So the danger there is we just inevitably move on this path of exclusion and repression if we say that Muslims have to be classical liberals or Muslims have to become secular. How do you force people to be liberal when part of what classical liberalism is about choice and autonomy and personal conviction? It would seem to be somewhat contradictory, right? Okay, so that's option one, and I'm skeptical of that option. The second option, which I will just outline very briefly here in sort of in broad terms, is also it's not ideal, but nothing is ideal when we're talking about a very difficult issue. But I would argue that we have to find a way to come to terms with Islam's role in public life, and more broadly, religion's role in public life. And this is why I said at the beginning that part of what I want to do is challenge conceptions of religion's role. And I think whenever we hear about religion playing a prominent role in public life, we automatically think that that's a sign of regression. And that's why when people hear me say Islamic exceptionalism, they might think that I'm making a pejorative argument about Islam. But that's only if you think religion playing a public role is necessarily and always a bad thing. Obviously, a lot of the time, religion playing a public role can be a bad thing, but is it always a bad thing? Not necessarily. And I think if we look at history, and this is sort of a different conversation, we can see how religion contributes to state building, social cohesion, group belonging, so on and so forth. So I want to be very clear about that I'm not making a pejorative argument about coming to terms with Islam's role in public life. That role, first of all, can take a lot of different forms. You can have more conservative interpretations or more progressive interpretations. Whatever the case may be, I think that the only way to be realistic about Muslim majority context going forward is to say we don't know exactly what form Islam will take, but in most cases, Islam will be a part of the public arena. And not just that, conversations around Islamic legal precepts or Islamic legal traditions will also be part of the public conversation. We don't have to like it as Westerners. We don't have to be comfortable with that. But we have to be realistic and say that it's unlikely for the foreseeable future, for the rest of our lives, that will change or that will no longer be the case. But I think part of that requires challenging part of our liberal faith. And again, here I'm using the word liberal in sort of the classical sense, the liberal faith that, but also I think in the American political sense of this need to minimize difference, of saying that we are all basically the same and we all basically want the same things, that all religions have an ultimate core. Of course that's true, but there are also profound differences between religions that we can't just wish away. And we're not doing justice to the ideas that these religions represent if we're trying to pretend that there's a way that we can all ultimately get along and be the same. And I think one example of this kind of rhetoric, just to give you, I think one that some of you might be familiar with. I think this was, October 2014, or maybe it was 2015, but it was the famous Bill Maher, Ben Affleck debate, where Ben Affleck, the famous actor, obviously, and director, got really angry at Bill Maher because they thought Bill Maher was being Islamophobic. Essentially, Bill Maher said something like, "Islam is the motherlode of bad ideas," which is kind of offensive. But Ben Affleck got worked up, and understandably so, and it was cool, I think, as an American Muslim to see someone famous defending us on national television. But part of Bill Maher's argument, when you really thought about it, didn't really make a whole lot of sense. Essentially, he was saying Muslims are just like us, which, in addition to being patronizing, he kind of expanded on that a little bit, and he actually said quite literally, Muslims like eating sandwiches too, as a way to sort of demonstrate that Muslims are like Christians, like Jews, and so on. We all like to eat sandwiches. And I can confirm that Muslims do in fact like eating sandwiches, but you can like eating sandwiches but also still believe that Islamic law should have something to say about public life. The two are not mutually exclusive. So I think it sort of gets to this fundamental issue of, are we really comfortable acknowledging difference? And I think more importantly, for our purposes, living with difference. And I think that is really the challenge that we're facing, not just in the Middle East, but for that matter also in our own country here. How do you live together peacefully with deep difference without resorting to violent conflict? So I'll end there, and thank you.
I have a short comment. This is one of the best lectures I've heard in the dozen or 24 times I've come to World Affairs Council. It contained a lot of really good information, but unfortunately, my conclusions are different.
I knew there was a catch.
If the system is so different, how do you see them fitting in the United States? How do you see them fitting into Europe? I have heard on CNN the imam from Brussels. I have heard the imam from Jerusalem say, just give us time, we'll outpopulate them. So I think Europe is on a downhill slope, and I don't think we want to go down that slope. So I'd appreciate your comments. I know this is not what you...
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. So my argument would apply mostly to Muslim majority context because, the question of whether or how to implement Islamic law or Islamic values would only become relevant if there's a large enough majority that can express that will through the democratic process. That said, obviously, I think in Europe in particular, perhaps less so in the US, there is a clash of cultures in the sense that, let's take France, for example. Most French non-Muslims are not particularly religious, and that goes for many European countries. But the Muslim minorities in these countries, according to the polling we have considerably higher levels of observance and take their religion more seriously, whatever that might mean in practice. So the question is, how do you, for a country like France, it becomes a very stark, difficult question, is how do you tolerate public expressions of religiosity in a country that has a kind of official and quite aggressive secularism? I'm biased because as an American Muslim, that the US model of integration has something to say on this, that American Muslims don't have to choose, or at least so far, they haven't had to choose. I can't speak for what will happen going forward. They don't have to choose between their American identity and their Muslim identity. That you can be a practicing Muslim who takes their religion seriously or strictly, but still be fully American. Why? Because the American conception of secularism isn't like the French version. It's much more accepting of public religiosity, and that's why Christian evangelicals can express their religious beliefs publicly, Orthodox Jews and conservative Muslims. And it doesn't make you less American to believe strongly in those religious values, whatever they might be, even if they go against the prevailing dominant culture. And this is becoming more of an issue with conservative Christians, for example, when it comes to opposition to gay marriage, or when it comes to pro-life positions or opposing abortion access, however you want to put it. And there is perhaps more of a clash, but I would argue that someone should theoretically be able to be considered fully American and still oppose gay marriage, even if we, as American liberals, are uncomfortable with that. That should not make you less American. People should be able to hold on to their religious values, however uncomfortable they might make us. So I think that model is an important one, and it really gets to this idea of tolerating expressions of religiosity, even if they might be illiberal, as long as they're expressed within the law and the constitution of the given country. Obviously, no one can express those sentiments by crossing certain red lines or breaking the law. So I think that is a model that could be more, that could be helpful in the European context of finding ways to become more accepting of religiosity, especially since now it's an interesting case of what would happen if, let's say, Muslims became a majority in a European country, but that's not going to happen anytime soon, certainly not in the next 100 years. It might never happen. So I think we also have to be careful of alarmist hypotheticals where there's this envisioned end state where Muslims take over or outpopulate, which is actually quite unlikely, also because, anyway, fertility rates do tend, anyway, not to go into the debates about how demography works, but I think we have to be careful about buying into those sort of demographic arguments.
My name is Kritik Agarwal. I'm an atheist by profession or by confession. And my wife is a Muslim, kind of an American Muslim, quote unquote, but does belong to a conservative family. So I've been dealing with this question quite a lot myself. I read a lot about books and things on this topic, but in the end, what really mattered was what 1.5 billion Muslims are reading every day, right? And what they're saying in prayers. After all, that's what constitutes the outcome, right? So we can analyze it here, but in the end, that's important. So a couple of questions on that. You mentioned that we have to live with the fact that there could be a way of having Islam in a political life and as part of the public life. And my question to you is that all the examples that you see out there aren't very fulfilling, right? Destruction of the Bamiyan statues by Taliban, if you take that as an example. Or Vilayat-e-Faqih, or the guardianship of the jurists in Iran. The persecution of Yazidis, the expulsion of Ahmadis in Pakistan. So these are all political ideas that have been sort of successfully taken up. My question to you would be is that what would be a good example, in your opinion, where you do see Islam becoming part of the public life without disintegrating into examples that I just gave?
Yeah, so you mentioned some of the negative examples of Islam playing a political role, and obviously there are quite a lot of them. Now, there are examples that don't get as much attention, which I think are worth looking at, although they are not perfect by any means. And I talk about these a little bit in the book. Malaysia and Indonesia in particular, also to a lesser extent Pakistan. It depends what you value, because Malaysia, Indonesia, and Pakistan are three of the most democratic, maybe Malaysia less so. Indonesia, though, is the largest Muslim majority democracy in the world and has often been hailed as a positive example. I don't want to use the word model because I don't want to jinx it too much. But Indonesia is a place where, first of all, Islamist parties are legal. Islamist parties are quite influential. And actually what's interesting is that there is even some degree of implementation of Sharia ordinances on the local level. Why? Because if you want to win on the local level, in religiously conservative areas, you have to offer religiously conservative ideas and proposals if you want to win. And this is where I would argue that democracy and more Islam in public life counterintuitively go hand in hand. That inevitably in religiously conservative societies, that will be reflected in the democratic process. And there's not a lot you can do about that, again, unless you want to ban certain parties or certain religious expressions. So as someone who values small d democracy, I think that it does come at the expense of certain things, because in some of these local areas, the implementation of some of these Sharia bylaws have restricted some aspects of personal freedom. And there are some of the obvious ways, not to go into all of them, but the ones that get a lot of attention are restricting alcohol consumption, sex segregation at certain levels of schooling, at least public schools, certain requirements of modest dress in certain local areas. Those are all problematic, but they are products of a democratic process, so they can also be undone if enough people vote for a different party or complain enough about these provisions going forward. But that's part of the democratic process, is that you can't guarantee the outcomes ahead of time. But if I have to choose between those examples and the examples of brutal repression in the name of fighting Islamist parties, I think the choice, at least from my standpoint, should be a clear one, because secular dictatorship is oftentimes the worst of both worlds. People aren't free anyway, because you can never have a free marketplace of ideas under dictatorship. So that's one part of it, but also they're quite repressive to people who do want Islam to maybe play a larger role in public life. Egypt being the most obvious example of that after the military coup of 2013. As many of you might know, the Muslim Brotherhood came to power through democratic elections for a variety of reasons. Secularists and liberals in the military opposed them, and a military coup happened, followed by a massacre in which 1,000 Muslim Brotherhood supporters were killed in the course of less than 24 hours in August 2013. So if you had a third option of liberal democracy, sort of along the lines of the kind of post-enlightenment model that you're talking about, then great. But if we don't have that as an open option, then I think we have to be realistic and say, well, having a democracy where maybe the outcomes aren't always perfect or the outcomes aren't always liberal is preferable to the alternative. And I would actually just also say that it's interesting, these tensions between liberalism and democracy, and again, here I'm talking about the classical liberal tradition of personal freedoms, constitutional rights, the sorts of things that we associate with our own Bill of Rights here in the U.S. There is a tension here in our own country. There is a tension throughout Europe with the rise of far-right populist parties. I would argue for the first time we've elected, in our history, the first time, an illiberal Democrat. I would argue Donald Trump is an illiberal Democrat, someone who has an ambivalent relationship to constitutional principles and the Bill of Rights and so on. But I would really defend his legitimacy, and this is something that I've been criticized for having a soft spot for Trump, simply because I think it's very important to accept the legitimacy of democratic outcomes and not do things like not my president or try to overturn election results through the Electoral College, if you might recall that little moment. Because we have a democratic process, and that means that we don't always like the outcomes. And that's also speaking as an American Muslim who I think on election night felt threatened personally by the election results. And I think there were a lot of questions, and still are, about what this means for the Muslim community going forward. But if there's one thing that I'm willing to defend and take very seriously, it's the idea that democratic outcomes have to be respected, no matter how scary or bad they are.
Hi, I'm Phoebe Thomas, and I'm a senior at Washington International School. Now, you discussed how the Quran, when it was made a long time ago, it needed to have both this sort of religious and political elements to it. Nowadays, when we've got such great globalization and this sort of merging of communities, what place do you think these political influences coming from the Quran will hold in not only society today, but in the future of society?
Yeah, so in our current globalized world, what's interesting is that it's not just in the context of the Middle East or the Muslim world where we're seeing a return to ideology, where people are saying that they actually like, it's very easy to talk to Muslims if you live or spend time in the Middle East who say, we like the fact that the Quran has something to say about legal matters, or that there is a classical Islamic tradition which includes what we would call today Sharia or Islamic law, because that gives them more meaning. It gives their politics more substance. And I think it's interesting that we're living in a time where more people in the West are saying that they are sort of bored of boredom and want a more exciting and ideological politics and are voting not for center-left or center-right candidates or parties, but those that are on the further ends of the spectrum, and why we're seeing the rise of ethno-nationalism or white identity politics or white nationalism, all these things that that are in a sense filling the vacuum that religion once filled in the West. So it's also a be careful what you wish for situation. Just because we see the decline of Christianity in the West doesn't mean that what replaces it is going to be nice, gentle, and fluffy. We might actually see more pernicious strains of ideology that take its place. But this gets to, I think, a broader, challenging question of what do humans really want? What ultimately motivates us? Do we naturally incline towards classical liberalism, or do we as human beings want more meaning in our politics? And that might actually lead us towards ideological passions that can actually lead to more conflict and not less. So I actually don't think that this sort of Islam's distinctiveness and having more to say about politics makes it out of step with the current age that we're living in. In some ways, it makes Islam more in step with the age that we're entering into.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.